Welcome to De-Stress Your Business, the podcast where we show you how to get incredible results in your business without constant stress. I'm Alexis Kingsbury, a serial entrepreneur and founder at Air Manual, and I'm joined by my co-founder and co-host, Paddy Mann. Good morning, Paddy.
Good morning.
So in our last episode, we looked at what happens when documented processes don't get used. Today, we're looking at what happens when those same processes don't get maintained. How do we stop the rot? How do we make sure that content doesn't go stale? So, Paddy, let's start with the impact. What happens when content goes stale in a business?
Well, so when content goes stale, I think this is something that most businesses are familiar with. You've created some content. Initially, it feels great. You get it out there. It gets used by a few times, and then over time it goes stale. And by stale, we mean it starts to have some inaccuracies in it, and people stop trusting it in the same way. And so, inevitably, if people aren't trusting it, if it's no longer seen as a definitive source of truth, then it's seen as something which either you shouldn't be using at all, or you should be using, but you should be skipping big, chunks of it. And that kind of gnaws away at all the benefits that you're trying to get out of it. You're trying to get the team to agree to, best standards on best practices on how to perform a task. And if the document's not doing that purpose, if it's not clear that we should always be following the guidance in it and we should be keeping it up to date, then it's not going to work. People aren't going to be following the best practices. They aren't going to be making further improvements. There won't be a culture within your team and business of setting, these kind of guidelines, ground rules of how your team should operate and building on it. Instead, it's back to square one. It's back to the best way to find out how to do anything is to ask someone else.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of, I've seen this at so many businesses now. Like even last week, I remember talking to various business owners who had implemented ISO. So, whether it's ISO 9001 or ISO 27001, 14001, like there's various different standards for essentially process management and control. And yet, often it started off at least as a methodology that they're putting in place to fulfill some customer requirement, right? And of course, given a relatively short period of time, they after creating all the documents and getting the accreditation, they're not using them. They're certainly not updating them. And there's a requirement when you come for re-accreditation that those documents have been reviewed and that there's some evidence that the business has been keeping its documents up to date. And I was talking to the business owners and they said, look, full disclosure, it's within a week of reaccreditation, we're just grabbing documents and writing on them, oh yes, this has been updated and so on. It's such a shame when you see that, because not only have you got the impact and the pain that as you describe, but also you're just not getting any of the benefit of something that should be a really valuable methodology or activity, just keeping things up to date on a regular basis, like live, living, breathing documents is kind of where you want your business to be, rather than a business that doesn't improve until the auditor is going to arrive, and even then it's just a tick box exercise. So what about in terms of the stress that's caused? What are some of the ways in which we see leaders, managers, employees having stress as a result of content going stale?
Well, yeah, good question. I think that probably goes back to all those kind of root levels of stress that people experience within business. It goes back to leaders who have way too much on their plate because they're constantly back in a position where they're answering questions, where mistakes are being made. The documented processes which you've put investment in time in rolling out, they now appear not to have worked, and so you're back, fighting fires, answering questions, doing the same things that you did before. You've stopped trusting the document, so you're going back to your old habits of using meetings and coaching to try and fix it. But We know that doesn't work. That just leads to a lot of content being shared which gets forgotten. It's not possible for anyone to have that kind of lecturing style of teaching, and for all the details to be remembered. And so you go back to mistakes being made, a lot of time being wasted, and that in turn, that leads to the stress. It leads to the stress of the manager, who gets frustrated because his team are back in the position where they no longer remember everything they need to do, and he starts to doubt, or she starts to doubt their ability to do their role. It leads to stress for the employees because they're just trying to work out how to do their basic job. Then they're not even able to go above and beyond because they're making mistakes. They know they're making mistakes on the basics, but they have no way to proactively fix it without going to their manager, and that leads to, again, conflict, working late at night, people not being able to go on holiday because they are always a dependency for the team to have their expert knowledge available, and all the rest of it. Documented processes are so key, so fundamental if you want to de-stress your business, that not having them, and it all falls down.
Yeah, agreed. And it's interesting that conflict point. I've definitely seen conflict between essentially manager and employee, or team members in more generally, when there's a discussion perhaps related to a particular activity. So let's say I'm working with a finance administrator on getting our quarterly VAT return done or whatever, and we hit some blocker, some issue, some question or mistake. And so we say, that's a good point. Hang on, we haven't addressed this properly. So let's put this in place. Let's fix these things, and or we at least agree what the changes should be. And in general, obviously the way that we work and the way that we work with our clients is that we get them in a position where, particularly because they can use their manual to do it, but we'll cover exactly what needs to be in place. Like, those changes are made live. I think so often the case for most businesses is the changes aren't made live. It's I'll fix that later, or I'll make a note or whatever. Mm-hmm. And of course then it doesn't happen, and that conflict that then happens next time round when you're having the same mistakes, the same questions, the same problems is really painful and a big cause of conflict. So I've kind of started to allude to a couple of things there, but how do we make sure that content gets updated and doesn't go stale?
So our goal is that we got content which doesn't go stale. I think the fundamentals here is it does need to be easy to find and use, and needs to get used. No one's going to bother maintaining content which isn't being used. And I'm not going to go so deep on this because our last episode goes more on to how to make it easy to. How to make the content easy to use, but it's the kind of the fundamentals we're going to be thinking about is just making sure that you've got a good organization of your content, that it's all tied to a business process, that you're using a sensible title, and so on and so forth. And you gave the example earlier of I don't know if you meant to say ISO or ISO, but you've got these big standards out there, and we've ourselves we use ISO 27001. It's a data security standard, and you end up with piles of policies and processes, and it was something we struggled with initially because a lot of the templates out there, yes, they tick every box, but no, they are not easy to use. And if they aren't easy to use, then of course people don't use them. It's if it doesn't solve their problem of helping them to perform a task or be clear on the expectations, if they are reading a document and getting a headache from it, then they will find another way. They will ask someone. They will work around it. So the second it's not easy to find and use, the maintenance bit kind of goes out the window. If we imagine that we have got content which is easy to find and use, so that's kind of the first part of the puzzle, then the next step is how can we make it really easy for team members to give feedback about content and make updates? Because what we really want to do is embed it into the team, the people who are using your checklists, your SOPs, your policies, to be giving the feedback directly. It's not, as a manager, you're often setting the expectations, but you're not actively using it day to day. You're not going to spot the issues, the challenges. You're not going to discover that steps 5 to 22 aren't actually possible if you don't have the right login credentials. You don't have that visibility, so it needs to be in the team. And there's a number of ways you can be doing that. So some of the ones we would encourage would be encourage it as a general expectation that the team should be raising issues and opportunities and suggesting improvements, particularly for junior colleagues. So junior team members, the first person into the someone who's just joined the team, you want to get it into their behaviors, into their psyche, that this is something that we do as a team. And that requires some coaching. So we encourage them as much as possible to take this positive step of proactively going, I think there's something we can improve. I think there's a change we can make. We can then support that with some other tools. We've talked about in your weekly meetings. One thing you can do is a retrospective where you look back at what's working and not working well, and that's an opportunity to look at all the processes in your team and go, are any of these processes holding us back? Is there any opportunity where we could be moving faster? You can be asking for feedback in the processes themselves. So at the end of doing a task, there can be a step to give feedback about that checklist. And some tools make this really easy. That it's really easy to flag or give a kind of a positive or negative feedback about the checklist or the policy that you've just read. And you also want to make sure that all your content's been reviewed at least every 12 months. So there's a variety of like small little systems that you can have built into your tools and into the way your team works, which just makes it really, really, really easy to give feedback in a timely fashion. And then if your team are clear that that's what they should be doing, then the only final thing to do is to hold them accountable for doing it. And just in the event where there is a process, there is a policy, and the team haven't maintained it with the way they are now working, then they need to be held accountable, and you need to make it clear that's not acceptable. The only standard you can have is that everything does need to be kept up to date the whole time, because when you let those standards slip, the team basically sees that as a rule for, I can do that everywhere from now on.
Yeah, no, I love that, and I think particularly on that last point, like it reminds me of the phrase "you get what you tolerate." As a business leader, if you accept that, oh well, lots of our stuff is out of date and it doesn't, it as a result, people don't make improvements and so on, you just get more of the same. Whereas when you raise the bar of your expectation of what people do, people would quite often meet it, and then it becomes easier. It becomes so much easier to keep things up to date when things in general are kept up to date, and there's an expectation, a realistic expectation, that things are kept up to date. And it reminds me of one of the earlier points you made around making sure that junior team members are able to raise issues and opportunities, suggest improvements, even make improvements. One of my favourite things when onboarding new members of the team is when they ask questions or they make mistakes or whatever as part of their first few days, weeks, and let's say it's a mistake. And so we'll have a discussion, and typically they're terrified, right? Because maybe it's the first mistake that they've made in the business, and the more timid might even be worrying, oh my goodness, what will this mean for my career, and so on. And of course, we would say, and indeed do say early on in the onboarding process, but that doesn't mean that people always believe it and hold it all the way through, that if you're making mistakes and having issues and not performing in the first few days and weeks, that's an us problem, not a you problem. We've taken you through the recruitment process, we've taken you through the onboarding process. It's up to us to make sure that all of that works. But occasionally you get questions and mistakes. My favourite thing is when they ask the question or you hit the mistake, is you go back and you look at the process, you look at the onboarding, you look at the training that they've had, and say, how could we have avoided this? And you'll perhaps discuss it with the employee, and they'll say, oh, well, yeah, I wasn't sure about this actually. Like, I thought it meant X, but now I realise it meant Y. And agreeing that, so let's make it clearer. What would it look like to be clearer? My favourite thing is getting them to do it. Because firstly, it starts that culture of the expectation is that this is kept up to date, this is how we solve problems, and they're doing it so early in their career with us. But secondly, it means that I'm not having to do it. and on an ongoing basis, that actually accumulates a lot of time. Thirdly, of course, it means I'm not getting the same mistake or the same question again. And fourthly, for them, it's an incredible experience to be improving the business and the onboarding and so on so soon in their journey in the business. So one of my favorite things is to do that as part of onboarding. But actually, at any point, particularly with junior team members, but anyone, is encouraging them and empowering them to make the changes. And I'm often asked by business owners, like, with Air Manual, can you lock who can edit processes and certain things and so on? And my answer is you can. There are features in Air Manual that allow you to, prevent certain people from being able to change anything or do it by folder and all these sorts of things. But my personal preference is that everyone technically can update any process, any folder, etc. The difference is what we've created in culture is that if someone is going to make a major change, they would expect to speak to the team about it and share it and post an update in the appropriate Slack channel and so on to let the rest of the team know. But we don't limit, that creativity and so on. So I think setting that expectation that things are updated and they're updated live, and encouraging people, particularly junior team members who might be more timid in doing it, to do it is really, really powerful. So love those suggestions and so on. Paddy, before we move to a wrap up, because I think in terms of guidance on how to make sure this all works and stays up to date, I think this is fantastic advice. Any other questions before we kind of wrap up, or thoughts, I should say?
No, I'll leave with one final thought, which is we kind of pose this as a question of keeping it maintained, which makes it feel like you're just kind of taking what you already have and making sure it doesn't stop working for you. And that is important. That does have huge value. It does mean the investment you've made in those initial documents doesn't fail. But the flip is to that is that this is also how you make it scale. As a business owner, as a business leader, if you can embed these behaviors into the team, then this is how you can get that consistency. And you need to set the expectation as you start at a high level in your organization, and set the expectations for your own team that everything needs to be kept to a high standard and maintained the whole time. You need that to be embedded in the behaviors and passed all the way down. Because if you can achieve that, then you're going to be able to create an organization that can grow its kind of own quality standards and best practices organically from that starting point. Whereas if you don't, you're going to get organic growth of another nature, and it's not going to be so calm.
Yeah, I love that. Such a good point around the scaling, because I can totally see examples where we've seen our team sort of rise to the challenge of scale through even just taking existing processes, copying them, maybe because it's for a slightly different product, or hiring into a slightly different role, or whatever it is, and then continuously improving that and updating it and so on, and feeling that confidence to it, and to do so without us having to micromanage that and so on. So yeah, I absolutely love that. Fantastic. Well, thanks very much, Paddy. So in summary, we've been talking about how to make sure that content doesn't go stale. As Paddy highlighted, the starting point needs to be that it needs to be easy to find and to use. If it's not being used, it's going to be impossible to make sure that it's maintained. And then you need to make sure that you're getting junior team members to raise issues and opportunities and suggest improvements, that you're doing retrospective on weekly calls, that you're asking for feedback at the end of processes, that you're making sure issues and opportunities are reviewed and tackled in a timely fashion, that you're making the changes live, and that you're keeping all of your content up to date and reviewed on a regular basis, perhaps at least once every 12 months. But then most important of all, perhaps, is set that expectation, raise the bar, hold the team accountable. Fantastic. Well, as our regular listeners will know, we also run a weekly webinar in addition to these podcast episodes, these lives. In that webinar, I'll be covering how to free up 15 hours per week and remove the constant stress of running a business without slowing down growth. It's the next one is coming up on Wednesday, 1 p.m. UK time. To find out more and to register, go to www.airmanual.co/webinar. I highly recommend it. I think you get a lot of value out of it, and we've had a fantastic feedback on it, so do go and check that out. A final note for our podcast listeners: as a new podcast, we need your help. If you found the content today valuable, could you please just take 1 minute to leave an honest review? This will help the podcast get more visibility and help more people. Thank you very much. Until next time, have fun.